Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am talking to Lucy Foulkes. Lucy is a psychologist, and she is the current honorary lecturer in psychology at University College London's Clinical, Educational and Health Psychology Department. She is also the author of the new book, Losing Our Minds, What Mental Illness Really Is and What It Isn't. And that's what we talk about in this conversation. We start by talking about how we define mental illness. We talk about acute versus chronic symptoms of mental illness. We spend some time discussing how we understand our conceptualization of mental disorders. And so we talk about the most recent DSM-5 and how that's been different and how we just understand have a better understanding of how we conceptualize mental disorders. We talk about pathology and non-pathological symptoms and the distinctions. And then I think about the second half of this conversation, we spend much of our time talking about de-stigmatization, how this works for athletes and public figures. We talk about social media and how destigmatization works on social media for many people. And then we end by talking about treatment for people that have mental illness or mental health issues within society and some of the challenges and some of the hopeful things that we can aspire to. I have to say that Lucy's book is very, 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 very good. I obviously read it and I enjoyed every bit of it. We need people talking about mental health and mental illness in ways that are accurate to the scientific literature. And, just being very honest about things. There's a lot of fads. There's a lot of things out there that are very trendy and aren't always accurate. And Lucy does a fabulous job of breaking all of that down in the book. She did that in the podcast here with me. And we just had a great time. And we also feel very similarly, I think, about many of the good things about destigmatizing mental health, but then some of the woes, some of the negative aspects of that. And we chat about that here. And so I really just loved talking about my field and with her and some of the things that I've seen as well and stuff I feel passionate about as well with her within mental health. So now I bring you Lucy Foulkes. I am here with Lucy Foulkes. Lucy, how's it going?
Good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. I really am excited that you decided to come on. You have a wonderful book, which is entitled Losing Our Minds, What Mental Illness Really Is and What It Isn't. It's a very awesome title. Did you get to decide the title? I know people sometimes don't get to decide their titles, but...
The title, The Losing Our Minds, was mine, and we had some discussion about the subtitle. And it's changed for the American version, actually, the subtitle.
Oh, okay. Do I have the American version? Or do I have the British version?
You have the English version. The American one's coming out in January.
Oh, okay. Cool. Very, very, very cool. So just real quick, tell people who you are, what you study, what you do, and reasons for writing the book.
Okay. I'm Lucy Foulkes. I'm an academic psychologist. My research mainly focuses on adolescence, so adolescent mental health and also social cognition and social behaviour. But I was very interested in mental health, particularly the way we were starting to talk about mental health and how a lot of sort of well-intentioned conversations and campaigns might mean people were kind of more confused than ever on this topic. So I wanted to write the book to try and provide, just explore the complexity of it, but also to try and provide a little bit of clarity on this topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you certainly do that. Reading the book, especially I think the first half, you give a lot of data, you give a lot of stats. I'll say for my American eyes, I was like, oh, I didn't know all these stats in the United Kingdom. That's very interesting. Usually much of the stuff is on mental health is very US centric. And so I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. So I don't know if that will change for the US version, but.
Yeah, well, in the US version, I had to go in a few places and kind of add in the equivalent US version. Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah. Okay, so I guess the first thing I want to ask you is, what do we mean when we say mental illness? I think let me sharpen that a little bit. What do, I guess, clinicians, psychologists, counselors, psychiatrists, what do we mean when we say mental illness? And then typically, how do lay folk usually kind of understand it, or in a general way understand mental illness?
Well, I think everyone across the board is interested in things that deviate from what's normal or common, although those are tricky words to define as well. But across our emotions, thoughts, and behaviour, and particularly when they become sufficiently extreme that they cause distress or they affect our ability to function and live the life that we want to live. That's, clinicians are particularly interested in that. To what extent is it stopping someone live the way they want to live, or kind of function in relationships and work, etc.
Yeah, and I think sometimes I can't remember if you talk about in the book, but sometimes we make a distinction between acute symptoms of mental illness and chronic symptoms of mental illness. I don't know if you want to say anything about that in particular, but sometimes that basically just kind of short-term, long-term kinds of things, and they're not mutually exclusive. Sometimes, you can have them both, there's overlap, et cetera, but there's that component too. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, I think chronicity is important in terms of it's one factor that people would look at to decide whether it's useful to call it a mental illness versus just, a sort of reaction to something difficult that's happened. So that's what I think of when you talk about being acute versus chronic. And certainly, yes, some people have these symptoms and this level of distress for a relatively short period of time, and some people have to navigate them for their whole lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you make a distinction between some of the more antiquated terms of madness or insanity, or not really?
Distinguishing between those two, or those two and
all three, actually. So mental illness, madness, insanity. I mean, most people don't use those terms clinically. I think there's some of those are legal terms, at least in the United States. That there are. Insanity, I think, is a legal term. But
it's interesting. I mean, they're not terms that I use, and they're certainly, they seem to be old-fashioned terms, certainly more stigmatizing terms traditionally. There's an interesting movement, it's certainly in the UK, I don't know about the States, about kind of reclaiming the word mad and madness. In terms of thinking about neurodiversity and just accepting that some people might have these symptoms that some people want to call disorder or an illness, but actually that they don't necessarily identify with that. And that movement is trying to reclaim the word mad in a more positive way. But I don't know a lot about it, to be honest. I think that the interesting distinction with illness or disorder is trying to come at it from a medical viewpoint, but also hopefully a more sympathetic, understanding viewpoint. Yeah.
I think some of the things that with, mental illness is something that will, impact everybody in some way, whether, one person will have, if you will, a disorder, which we'll get into, but then also, if you have a relative or you have friends or you have colleagues. And so I think it's been pretty stigmatized for a long time. And so, again, I think it's important that, we have, it's what your book does so well. It's like, okay, as of right now, what do we know? Okay, how do we define it? Okay, but how do we also understand what it is and what it isn't? And I think that's really difficult sometimes for people because they'll have antiquated ideas about it, or they'll have incorrect or inaccurate ideas about it. And so your book is good at trying to clear a lot of that up. Obviously, the big thing is the DSM. The DSM manual. So we're at, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. And that's in the 5th edition now. So I'm not going to bore listeners with the history of the DSM, right? DSM 1 to 2, 3, and all the different changes and stuff like that. But as it is currently, each time a new one comes out, which is usually every 15 to 20 years, there's new disorders, right? And can we really say, are there just new things we keep finding that are disorderly enough to say, like, look, there's there's significant impairment in this particular issue with these amount of symptoms over this time? And it's like, well, where was this 10 years ago? Is it just we're doing more work in the literature and research, or are we just finding different ways of reclassifying some of these, experiences? And so what are your, I guess, ideas about that in terms of DSM and disorders and stuff?
I guess it's a bit of both, but I think it's important to recognize the role of that second process. It's not like mental illnesses are entities out there that exist and that we're just waiting to, like archaeologists uncover them. I think that's a very interesting thing to think about with the DSM. It's essentially one framework, one way of trying to draw fences around certain groups of symptoms and give them names. But I don't think they're sort of biological truths. I mean, I think that the symptoms are real and that people experience them, but the way that we group them together and the names that we give them are malleable. They're changing all the time. You don't need to go back that far in history to realize how many different names we've given to the same things. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think that means that people's experiences of those symptoms aren't real, but the names are kind of flexible and up for grabs, I guess.
Yeah, let's take a small example, right? So, for example, if I have depression or anxiety, let's say, which are fairly common for many people, and if I put 10 people in this room and we all have the same diagnosis, that, let's say it's depression, that's going to manifest differently. We could all have, again, with depression, you need to have 5 of 9 symptoms over a 2-week period to have a major depressive episode, along with many other things. And let's say you and I and 8 other people meet that criteria, but it's going to look different. And so in that way, right, isn't disorders kind of what you're saying, right? It says we're not digging up new things. And even for ones that have been around for a while, is just a kind of restructuring or reclassifying in a way that is, disorders are they're a heuristic, they're a shorthand. Instead of naming all of the symptoms or naming all of the varied presentations, we can say, here's at least what it is. It can look and present differently, but it is these things, or at least how we conceptualize them. So, it could be anhedonia or hopelessness or decreased appetite, restlessness or, distractibility. There's many different symptoms for depression. But you might not have all of them, or, somebody might have different levels of it, or it's going to look different for somebody. And so is that a way of trying to understand how, these terms are good, but to a point, right? They're trying to just almost be a catch-all to collect, okay, at a bare minimum, this is what it is, but we still have to look at each individual person's presentation to know what depression is experienced like for them, or how would you understand that?
Yeah, I think you summarize it well. I think they are heuristics. I think that even if it is a construct, it's still useful. You need to call it something. But I think you're right in that it's important to have recognition. With, depression is an excellent example that 2 people with depression can have literally have totally different symptoms and still meet the criteria. And then added to that, when you talk about 10 people in the room, is with depression, is that you will also get people who have self-diagnosed with depression, or that term has been more loosely used by someone else. And again, that adds to the complication. So even lots of people now who identify as having depression don't actually necessarily meet the official DSM criteria for depression. So it's an extremely varied term. And you're right that the sort of solution to that is that you actually listen to the individual and see how it manifests for them.
Yeah. I think sometimes the self-diagnosis is as another danger, I think. One of the things is that what people will do, so in another way, people will take this idea of, well, I see this happen a lot with ADHD, right? Which will be, well, I'm distracted, or my kid's hyperactive and they're bouncing around, and, so they must have ADHD. And saying, no, this needs to be in 2 settings. You need to have at least these 6 symptoms, or you have to have 6 symptoms out of, I think, 12. There's certain, there has to be an impairment. There's all of this criteria, and many people will take 1 or 2 or a handful of very overt or common symptoms and say, aha, here it is. And it's like, actually that's not accurate, which kind of goes to my other point is there a danger of over pathologizing people, right? Where we're saying, well, if everyone's got something, well, that's also problematic in terms of the accuracy and maybe, just how we're understanding behavior in general for humans. So how do we avoid kind of the over pathologizing kind of thing?
I mean, yeah, your point is a big part of why I was interested in writing the book, actually. So I think part of this increasing conversation about mental health, one of the consequences is that symptoms are now being equated with having the disorder in itself. So, for example, if you're easily distracted, then that's kind of equivalent to having ADHD. It's completely understandable why this happens and why people do it. I mean, we all want language and labels to understand our experience, and this is the language that we're giving people. We're pumping out all this terminology like ADHD. So I think it's understandable that it happens. It's not straightforward to take away that language from people at all. And people, especially since the criteria kind of made up, it doesn't, just because you fall below the threshold doesn't mean you don't need help or you don't need to be listened to. But yeah, my concern is exactly what you say, is that if we use this language too loosely, then sort of everyone has a pathology or a disorder in a way that's actually not helpful for anyone, including that individual.
Yeah, I 110% agree. And just to reiterate, symptoms do not equate disorder, and many people are very confused about this. And part of that may be, clinicians don't always do a good job of explaining things, and or there's some dangers in how it's talked about in social media, mass media, things like that. So we'll get to that. I guess the other point here is we have a lot of terms like trauma or obsessive or obsessive compulsive or antisocial, or a lot of these kind of clinical terms have become kind of these colloquialisms that people use in everyday language, right? And how can we understand how to not export those types of things out into society where it's harmful, right? If someone says, well, that just must be my OCD flaring up. Well, I mean, that's A, not accurate, but B, I don't think people are that fragile. But OCD is a terribly debilitating disorder, and for because someone went and checked to see if their lights were on, saying those things over and over and over when people do that in society, I don't think is always very helpful, because then when you do see someone that has it, there is a distinction. So how do we get these terms, how do we have better ways of talking about these terms, especially the trauma thing? Everything's trauma, and that's a serious charge. It's a serious claim to say that. So how do we correct for that, or have more accurate ways of engaging about how to use some of these terms?
I think, it's about progressing the conversation. I think it's brilliant that we've started talking about it, but I think the next step now is to provide a little bit more nuance and depth, which is exactly what I was trying to do with the book. So, I think once you have read a description of what OCD really is, then people aren't using, when people say, I've got OCD because, I like things lined up, or I like, because I went to check my lights, they're not doing that maliciously. It's I think if you provided more information about what the disorder is, then people are generally more cautious about using those terms. So I think that's an important part of the conversation, is just to add depth now. We've started using these words. That's great that they're becoming more familiar, but let's, provide a little bit more information now. And then I think the other thing is that to provide alternative language, people want language to understand their experiences. So if you are having a really difficult time, and you're saying you're depressed, it's not useful to just tell that person they're not allowed to say they're depressed, right? So you need to sort of, give alternative language like feeling down, for example. And also just we need to also, as culturally respect the distress that doesn't meet full criteria. All this stuff is still really hard just because you don't have a full-blown disorder. And I think partly people use the language because that's the only language that's taken seriously now.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. I think that there's like a weird thing that kind of has evolved, which is this, well, okay, if I'm going to call it this term or this label, and some people will try and look for that. Oh, okay, that's what I have. Or I must have this or something like that. And if they just have symptoms, right, and they don't have a disorder, that should be a good thing. But then it's like, yeah, but I'm still in a lot of pain, or I'm still suffering, or I still have a lot of challenges. And then it becomes this kind of in-group, out-group thing. Well, I'm not part of this group of sorts that have a disorder, an issue, and that for some people can provide a lot of clarity. It can provide a lot of like solace of like, oh, okay, I know what it is. I can work on it. And so for people that don't, it's like, oh, okay, well, I don't have that, but I still have these symptoms, and I don't think have really good answers for how to conceptualize that or solve that. And I think in many cases, and I think that's a weird kind of like middle area that is, I don't think as explored as much.
I mean, this is the problem, the big kind of gray area where people are distressed. They need help and need language and need a framework for understanding that. Like social anxiety, for example, I mean, lots of people are kind of prone to being anxious in social situations. And they might find it useful to be able to talk about that and have language for that. But they don't necessarily meet criteria for having social anxiety disorder. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's the art, and that's the conversation that I've at least tried to start, is how can we recognize that big gray area that we need to take seriously, but that we shouldn't necessarily call a disorder or an illness.
Yeah. Well, it sort of kind of leads into my next point, which is about de-stigmatization, which is I have such mixed feelings about this. I don't know how you feel about it, but I have such mixed feelings about this de-stigma campaign that people have. So I'll kind of give my pros of it a little bit. I think initially, and I think overall, it's probably a net positive, right? For so long, we've had people that are definitely stigmatized. That still happens for having mental health or mental illness. I think in some ways, some are more socially acceptable now as opposed to others. So if I say, oh, I have depression, I go to therapy, I take meds. Oh, okay, cool. If I say, well, I have schizophrenia, it's like, oh, and people think of, a beautiful mind or something like that. And it's like, you hear voices and you see, and again, schizophrenia is a very challenging disorder, but it can be managed. And there are people that can learn to manage it and have very functional lives in society. So, I think we start breaking out into these classifications of things. Of like, well, I have, clinical anxiety or something, excuse me, or I have, generalized anxiety. Oh, okay. And people, will kind of dismiss it as, I hate that term, the common cold, of mental illness, depression or anxiety. But so as we've been kind of alluding to, there's all these campaigns. You see public figures, you see athletes, politicians that will come out and say, I have depression, or I have social anxiety, or I have ADHD, or I have, whatever. And I think that's a good thing overall for some people but it becomes a kind of signaling of sorts. And, so I'll just tee it up, I guess, in a general way. What are your general thoughts, I guess, positive, negative about this? And what do you think are the best ways of talking about mental health publicly, so it doesn't become these like, this kind of signaling thing or this victimized kind of thing and, or wanting to get all these things or anything else? How do you think are appropriate ways to kind of talk about mental health, publicly, or just in general?
I think I hope that there has been a net gain. I think there has. But I think we still have quite a long way to go in terms of stigma. And yet you raised the good point that it's not equal across disorders. Some disorders are becoming more acceptable to talk about, and some still aren't. So that's an issue. That's an area where we need to improve. I think there's also been an interesting kind of backlash, certainly in the UK, in that people seem almost fatigued by how much people are talking about their mental health. So people are now skeptical of any admissions of it, and they're making their own interpretation of what counts and what doesn't count. Meghan Markle is a good example, talking about having suicidal thoughts, and the tennis player Naomi Osaka taking time off for mental health problems. I've not read up on it, but I've seen the gymnast Simone Biles has pulled out something to do with mental health. I haven't read up on it, but you get this strange backlash where people are now saying, no, you don't have mental health problems, or that doesn't count. I don't believe you. So, and I think that's partly a consequence from so many people talking about it, which is a sort of horrible irony to it. In terms of the solution, I think people need to have a little bit more respect for other people. I think the default should be to believe people. If someone, an athlete, said they had an ankle injury, you just take that at face value. The default should be that they're telling the truth. You have to believe people, otherwise the whole thing falls apart. And we have some very vocal, prominent figures leading this kind of disbelief charge, and that's a problem. So I think, we need to have a little bit more respect for when people do admit problems. I think a useful thing that people with mental health problems can do is to talk about what it's like, so that you understand what OCD is or what PTSD is. But that's really tricky, because we shouldn't necessarily be on them, on people who are unwell.
Yeah.
What it's like. There's not an easy answer.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think yes, it's not on people that are suffering to explain. I would hope at some point we could get to a place where we have, taking the athletes case that you were bringing up, sports psychologists that are able to maybe jointly put out a statement, or do the press conference jointly and say, right, the person, the athlete, the public figure can say, this is what I have going on. This is an injury of sorts, and in one way, and this is what, loosely what the experience is like, very, very generally. And, then you have the, whoever's on their team or whatever, the sports psychologist, to say, okay, this is what depression is, or this is what anxiety is. This is how debilitating it can be. We understand this. Many people around the world suffer from this, including athletes, including, public figures. And I'm going to keep working at it, whatever, something like that. So it's not, someone pulls out of an event, or, someone just comes out and says, well, I have this thing, and it means something different to everybody. Or, people will say, like, oh, come on, like, oh, you're a little anxious and you can't do this. You're like, and people will dismiss it, whatever. You're going to have people that say that anyways. But I do think that it becomes, I do think there's an importance, kind of like we were mentioning earlier, of, very seriously and accurately, again, not the person necessarily, but, what that is, and just kind of a little bit what it's like. In some ways, much as if you would say, hey, and again, going to athletes, I'm pulling out of this because, I have a, I have a small tear and this and this and this. And sometimes you'll have doctors that will come aside and say, this is where it is. We're working on this. I don't think it should be any different.
Yeah. People who are in positions of influence, to be able to explain what these things are. Yeah, not necessarily what one specific athlete is experiencing, but to talk about, what social anxiety is like when, in its clinical form, and how crippling that is, and how, of course, it's going to be difficult to do press conferences if you have that. To provide a little bit of education and to hopefully help people be a bit more compassionate. I do think we're at the stage where we need to provide that extra information, because otherwise people are reading the headlines and going, that's not such a problem, or that she doesn't have it very badly.
Right.
So I think we need people admitting these problems alongside people explaining what the problems are. I think that would help.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. What about this is a kind of a big topic, and I think you kind of allude to it or mention it in some parts in the book. People that are, I see this all the time. I've been seeing it for years. I'm sure you do too, where people are disclosing in the name of destigmatization their mental health issues, or trauma or past traumas on various social media platforms, a Facebook post, a Twitter thread, an Instagram post, on and on and on. Well, let me ask this. Can I give me a little runway, and I'll just tell you some of my two issues with this. So first, when someone shares mental health symptoms online, what can happen is that I think sometimes people will come from a really good place. They'll say, I want to get this out. I want to just, not feel, worn down by this. And, they want to be able to talk about it a little bit more. And of course you have, people saying like, we should do that, don't hide it. We need to destigmatize this. But I think what can happen is that can leave someone, when you post something on the internet, exposed and vulnerable to bullying, ridicule, public shame. And when you have, no one knows the how chronic this is and or acute, no one knows how severe this is. No one has any idea. It's words on a screen. And someone may say like, some horrible things. And then that will, again, each person's different. That will impact the person that's already in a dark space or in a really tough space. That's a big vulnerability. And I think you mentioned earlier, this irony of, well, destigmatize, talk about it. It's like, I'm not entirely in a just a blanketed general way saying, yes, let's just do that all the time. And, the best way to do that is a Facebook post. I'm going to talk about my past sexual trauma with so-and-so, and I'm going to make a Facebook post, long Facebook post, and I've got it out, and I'm doing the work of doing that. I think that's extremely dangerous. I think some of the examples are, various public figures, certain Hollywood stars that come out and they make a long Instagram post about all of these things, and they feel really liberated. And I just don't think those in one sense are the best examples. I think it's good that we're talking about it in a way, but I think when you get down to the very specifics of each individual person, the place to do that is not social media. And that's the first thing. I think that's dangerous, and it could further exacerbate symptoms. So that's one thing. The second thing is, it can sometimes kind of create this like feedback. So it's like there's this rewarding kind of principle, right? Where you get a lot of online sympathy, you're going to get a lot of empathy. People are going to be like, this is really brave. This is really, taking a big risk, and you're going to get a lot of, if you will, rewards for that. And so then that can sometimes do is, well, that just creates for a lot of people this sort of negative cycle. Oh, okay. So the next time I'm feeling next time I have a depressive episode, I'll just post online, and then all these people are going to tell me like, it's going to be okay, and I'm going to get this attention. I'm going to get all these really positive statements, and then it becomes this kind of reinforcing principle of oversharing, and then it's almost like a very, again, it's another exposing thing. But what can also happen, I think, sometimes is, well, people will start to actually avoid dealing with the issues because you're just getting this positive feedback loop of sorts of like, okay, well, I keep saying this and people tell me all the things I want to hear at that moment. And so people will avoid therapy. Or, I mean, I've heard people say this. They'll say, well, I'll just, listen to a podcast about, mental health, and that's all I need. I don't need to go to therapy or deal with the issues, which is, fine to do some of that. But I think it's one of those things where the hard work is getting in a therapy room and really dealing with head on your personal things and your personal life, and anything outside of that is informational, and that's fine, but it's not a replacement for that. And so, I'm wondering if, by people sharing, it can actually lead people to avoid dealing actually with their challenges in therapy, or worse, having random strangers on the internet and not professionals commenting on one's mental health symptoms. Well, this is how it was for me, so this is how it should be for you, or I'm just sharing my experience. And that's, again, that has its place, but that can be inadvertently very, very dangerous and risky. So, those are my two, I see the two biggest risks of oversharing or sharing mental health symptoms on social media. And so I don't know, am I completely wrong on this, or what are your thoughts on this?
Well, you covered a lot there and a lot of interesting things. You're right that there is still the risk of bullying and ridicule. I think, we've seen that in the last few months with people like Naomi Osaka. Some, you get a real divide. Some people are really supportive about her coming forward, and some people are, skeptical and critical. So I do still think it's a risk, especially for public figures. I don't kind of blanket think it's a bad thing, because I think that is when it's done well, it's a really useful way of getting the information out there about what mental health problems and mental illness are really like. The other, there's various interesting things that you said, particularly in terms of it replacing therapy. It's quite different in the UK because you have to wait so long to get therapy on the NHS, or you have to have enough money to pay for it yourself. So I think quite often people are relying on online support because they can't get therapy, rather than because they don't want it.
Sure.
And then, this is an interesting point about whether it might sort of end up maintaining the problem because it's rewarding to get, attention and sympathy and feedback online. I don't know. It's a very interesting possibility. I worry particularly about young people, teenagers absorbing these things as part of their identity, rather than seeing it as something that they might be able to treat or get help for. If those two things are, incompatible with each other, and then they choose the idea that, or they get stuck in the idea that it's part of who they are. Mm-hmm. And it's something, it's an online identity in particular, that concerns me. Yeah. But also at the same time, there's lots of people who've had enormous help from sharing and getting support online. And they, some people who are doing a brilliant service in terms of, providing detail about what these problems are. So I don't know. You can't conclude anything general about across the board. I think people use it in good and bad ways.
Yeah. And I would agree. Yes, I would agree that, I didn't say some of the positive aspects of it, but yes, it can be something that for people that feel some sense of isolation, whether as a clinical symptom or just in more of a general way, it can be really helpful. It can create a network. It can be something that people can rely on. There can be some type of peer support, especially over the past year, on and on and on. For sure. And I think there are really, really positive advantages, such as what you've listed, what I've listed. I guess I guess I just worry though about these negative aspects because of what we see of the dangers of social media and how it impacts people and their mental health. And I know some of the literature is mixed on how much of it of social media is the problem, and all that kind of sort of chicken egg thing. But there's definitely a impact. It is a variable. So I don't know. I feel like every time I say this, I'm always like, some kind of like weird boomer of sorts where I'm like anti like social media. I'm really not. I really am not. But I just worry. I just worry about people. I just worry when I see people and they're posting things. I'm like, oh goodness, like it's just not it's not the place to do that. It's not the place to talk about your trauma on, on a Twitter thread. It's just not the place.
Yeah. And it's sad if it suggests that they don't have an alternative means of support that might be more useful.
Yeah. And that sometimes is what's also concerning. It's like, oh, man, well, maybe this person that's the only place they can do it. And it's like, my goodness, my assumption is that there's a deep loneliness that's there. And my goodness, that is even, hard. And it's just hard, right? Because then sometimes it gives viewers like, well, should I say something? Should I do something? How much do I get involved? And it becomes, I think, it can be a strange dynamic of sorts.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, and I think if people are already vulnerable and they can seek out certain information online that might not be helpful for them, in terms of self-harm and suicide in particular, I think that's a bad aspect of social media. But equally, people can find loads of support online. I think there's not such a big distinction between online and offline support as we sometimes think. If you find that's your most useful way of connecting with people and it's useful, then that's okay. But yeah, if it's a sort of, if it's an outlet when actually they really need some different, possibly more professional support, then that's a bad thing for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the last things on this piece is, I know this happens with adolescents, and we could probably have a separate long conversation about this, but I've done some work with adolescents, and I've known that people have used, group messages, or they've used, Snapchat or something like that to have some pretty explicit thoughts and sharing of feelings about suicidal ideations and or suicidal gestures, and even some type of coaching on how to best do it, and just some really 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 awful stuff. And a lot of the times it will be with peers. So I'm talking now like actual friends, at a school or something like that, where they will get on a group message or whatever, and they will, overshare pretty consistently all of their, pretty dark thoughts about suicidality, and it becomes just this like, again, with people, actual friends, people they know in real life, people they go to school with or whatever. And I worry about that too, right? Which is, how peer support is super important, right? I think it's super important, especially for adolescents. I really do. Good, healthy peer support is really good. And I think sometimes many adolescents will share some of their emotional and mental health feelings with their friends and coming from a very, very good, positive place. But it can leave people really exposed, and their, friends will be like, well, my friend told me that he was thinking about killing himself in this way or this way or this way. And I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. What do I do? And then everyone was chiming in and everyone was saying this, and it can become really messy. So how do we, in terms of, I think for young people, I think you've worked with adolescents, how do we kind of, as clinicians, and then I think just in general, how do we, share with people, or how do we educate people or young people appropriate and kind of inappropriate ways to kind of share or talk about mental health challenges?
I think that's, again, it's an important next step in the conversation as well. And I ended the book talking about this because I think it's not very useful to encourage everyone to talk about mental health problems if the person that they're talking to doesn't know what to say. So I think the next step needs to be providing a bit of information about how you respond to someone in distress, because a lot of people still don't know how to do that, because it's really difficult and it's scary if someone says that they want to hurt themselves, for example. So I think, yeah, and it's a big thing to put on adolescents to try and support each other.
Yeah.
It's also interesting talking about, that these things, contagious is quite a dramatic word, but adolescents and adults influence each other. And, especially when it comes to things like self-harm, if you're a teenager and you have a friend that self-harms, then you're more likely to self-harm as well. And people who self-harm will exchange ideas about how to do it. For example, people will go online for that information. So the propensity for adolescents to influence each other is a big problem when it comes to mental health stuff. And it's a big question for how we talk about this, how we provide information about something like self-harm, for example, without providing, ideas about it, I guess. So yeah, there's no easy answer, but I think it's an important problem.
Yeah. Sometimes when I work with adolescents, I don't work with them too much anymore, every now and then, but, and I've had this come up, and I'll say you can use peer support for many things, but then there is, therapy and clinical support for other things. And you cannot unload everything to peers because they don't know what to do. And they may want to, but they don't know what the best way to do it is. And so, it's and again, in my situation, they were able to be in therapy. But again, there's many, 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 many adolescents that are not, and they have no access or resource. And that is another challenge. So, yes, it is super messy. It's super messy. So again, this kind of leads to the last point is treatment. Lots of treatments float around in society. And, that can be a pretty difficult labyrinth to navigate. I don't know if I did it here or, there was, I think maybe I did one podcast where I was just talking about what's like all the steps in the process to like getting into like, let's say therapy, like it's just a shit show. I mean, it's just absolutely like, from finding someone to insurance to scheduling to, just to get in there. I mean, it's just a lot. It's, I don't know how it is in the UK. You guys have different healthcare system and stuff, but I'm going to assume it has its own maze of or hurdles to overcome as well. So, which whatever. I mean, that's another conversation in itself, right? That's just frustrating. But whatever. Managed care is difficult. But yeah, I guess my last point is what are the best ways for how we can tell people on how to access treatment and what to do and how to do things. Again, you've mentioned it that if people don't, then they'll try and just do their next best thing, which is why people do, people like motivational stuff or self-help stuff or, kind of the other things on social media, which they have some value, I think, in some ways, but they're obviously not a replacement. So how do we try and tell people how to best get access to treatment in, I guess, in a general sense?
The problem in the UK is that there aren't the resources in the NHS at the moment to provide therapy for people who need therapy. And it's a frustrating thing about all the campaigns at the moment that's encouraging people to talk more about their mental health and seek help. And then they turn up to try and get help and it's not available. And that's really damaging, and you contribute to the problem if you're vulnerable and depressed and you turn up somewhere and they tell you, that you can't, there's not access to help, or that you're not bad enough for help. So I really wish in this country that we could match the enthusiasm for telling people to talk about their mental health with resources, when people actually do turn up and try and get help. There's so much. I mean, I know more about child and adolescent services, but the threshold that you're supposed to meet to get help is just, plenty of services saying that you need to kind of be actively suicidal to get any help. Otherwise, you're just turned away.
Just to get like talk therapy.
Yeah. And just ridiculous waiting lists of kind of, 6 months, a year, 18 months. And even waiting like 2 weeks if you're in crisis, that's a long time. And what can happen in those months and in terms of how disillusioned you can get with the system. So that's kind of my number one wish, is that people who need help could actually get it. And then you get this kind of 2-tier system where people who can pay for treatment. If you can pay to see a therapist in the UK, then you can see one next week. So you do get this 2-tier system.
Yeah, that's not quite the same the United States has its own issues, but with healthcare, but there are also many challenges, and the same thing applies here. Is there is a kind of for a long time, talk therapy, let's just use that for a minute, was a very privileged, and I mean that in the literal sense of the word, like privileged, like you had to be very wealthy, upper class, money to pay, $250 an hour every week. Right. Again, nobody has $1,000 to see, 4 sessions in a month for, a therapist out of pocket. And so it does become this divide, and the people that typically usually need treatments, they don't have, money to pay out of pocket like that. And we can't figure it out how to, it's very frustrating. It's like, yes, talk about it, destigmatize, seek help, get treatment. And then they're like, yeah, well, I do. And I can't fucking get any treatment. It's like, so what am I supposed to do? And it's just, it's creating this bottleneck of sorts. And I feel it's very frustrating. It's very, very frustrating. And I think there's kind of adjacent to this is, kind of the substance abuse treatment. In the United States, we have, big problem with people overdosing and using drugs, and especially, prescription drugs in negative ways. Same thing, and then people are, they're, until people are dying and they're overdosing, and it's like, oh, we have a big, opioid crisis problem. It's like, yeah, we've had that for a long time, and you tell people to go get treatment, and then they can't for all of these reasons. For me clinically, I've had plenty of clients that they change insurance or whatever, and then they can't. Literally 1 week to the next, they just can't keep coming. It's like, how is that helpful? How is that helpful? We're pushing all of these big campaigns and all this stuff of, talk about mental health, blah, blah, blah. And okay, well then I want to go and get it. And it's just, it's just so many obstacles, and it is extremely frustrating.
I've noticed now there actually is more of an active backlash now against these campaigns and these kind of, people paying lip service to the idea of go and get treatment. So for example, on Twitter, like they recently appointed a kind of a sort of celebrity NHS doctor to be an ambassador to do with mental health, and almost, and when his appointment was announced, but also almost anything he says on Twitter about go and get help, you get this stream of responses that are saying, we don't need another figurehead. We need you to fund our services.
That's right,
I've tried to get help and I can't.
Yeah.
So I think already there's this, again, a kind of backlash with the conversation, don't stop telling more people to be more aware of their mental health, because we can't help them.
Yeah. I feel so like, I feel strong emotions. I feel the opposite emotions very strongly, I guess you could say, about mental health campaigns. On the one hand, I'm like, great. This is great. We get to talk about it, where people get more familiar with it. People get all these things. And then at the same time, every time I see them, I roll my eyes and I'm like, oh boy, this is it almost feels like propaganda of sorts. It's just like, okay. And it's a lot of very, very, very wealthy, rich people that are saying how, difficult their life is. And look, everyone has a difficult time in all of their lives, whether you have money, you don't, you're famous, you're not famous. But it's like you had no challenge in getting treatment. You could pay out of pocket if you wanted. You could immediately hear, you use your, and almost everybody else for the overwhelming majority cannot do that. And so that's the, that's not the sexy, tagline of whatever. And, you can't dress it up and talk about like mental health funding and, what various countries, no one wants to really talk about that. But I think that is the nuanced issue we're confronting. So I guess in lieu of that, right? So we, obviously you and I, we see this, we feel, very, very similar on this. Is there any ways of trying to, in the interim, kind of supplement that of sorts, or I mean, again, it's just so hard to just kind of put this on people that are hurting, to be like, okay, here, figure it out. It's very nuanced and you have to do all this work. And when someone's depressed and unmotivated, that's like the last thing they want to do. But is there any optimistic things we can say about treatment?
Yeah. I mean, well, firstly, I mean, if you need help, go and ask for it, because it's certainly not true that, not everyone's turned away, and lots of people have had positive experience about NHS treatment. Either they actually didn't have to wait that long for it, or they did have to wait, but it was still helpful. So I don't think the idea is that to sort of give up on even trying to get help. Yeah. And then, I hope possibly, I mean, it's not really the case at the more severe end, exactly what you just said, but I would hope that there could be some sort of empowering message about there's quite a lot you can do to look after yourself for more sort of transient, temporary problems. Because I do wonder sometimes now we're pushing the medical model so hard that we're almost implying that you can't look after yourself. You have to go and outsource getting help. But actually there's a lot you can do, for milder, more manageable problems that you can do yourself. And also good old fashioned social support. Like, I think that's got a little bit lost, and, the power of being looked after and supported by other people. I'm a huge advocate of power of exercise. I think there's lots of interesting stuff emerging about diet. How diet affects anxiety and depression, sleep. I mean, the trouble with all these things is that, it places the onus on you to solve the problem, and you might not be able to. And also you might, the source of the problem might be some very legitimate external stress. So I'm always slightly cautious about these things. It's not, if it was easy and just a case of everyone going for a run, then we wouldn't have a problem. Right. But having said that, I do think that there are lots of things you can do, lots of kind of body-based stuff that can actually really impact your mental health and help you just cope and navigate a difficult period. I'm a big advocate of that, but I'm always slightly cautious because there are some people for whom that's just not relevant. Yeah.
Again, it's dependent, but I think on each person in their situation. But I think, for many people that can be, those things aren't necessarily going to be a negative for you, right? Obviously, you could exercise too much, or you could, diet in unhealthy ways. But in the general abstract of it, I mean, it's good to, eat well, eat healthy, exercise, obviously, get good sleep, et cetera. So I definitely agree with you there. The last question I have for you is, where do you see therapeutic interventions going in the future, and as we evolve as a society, kind of generally, or I guess in the UK for you, how will technology help or hurt us, or just kind of in terms of looking towards the future and how we're doing things, and we've talked about some of the obviously problems, but where are some of the, in terms of interventions and how we're able to help people and how we're able to educate people about mental health, where do you see it kind of going in the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, well, firstly, I'd hope it would be very cool to reach a point where anyone who needs therapy can get it, not necessarily even if you have a mental illness or a disorder, but just if you're going through something difficult, if you're grieving or you've broken up with someone or you're struggling with something, there's an incredible power in talking to professional stranger about those things. So it would be wonderful if that could be more accessible to people. I think there's cool stuff happening in terms of combining, I don't know if medication is the right word, but biological interventions with therapy. So stuff like psychedelics, taking psychedelics before having a therapeutic session and how that might help. So I think that idea of combining the two, using medication to put your mind in a different state in order to experience the therapy. I think that's a really cool idea. It'd be nice to see that becoming more mainstream.
I definitely agree there. I think at least the United States, we lost 40 years of research because of political bullshit, and it's really, really frustrating. Just a lot of that stuff it's got some legs under it now. It's a lot of good research on it, a lot of papers coming out. It's been going, it's humming along for about 10 years on the psychedelics. Most of the stuff that I've seen at this point, like you take an example of psilocybin mushrooms, can be really, really good, but a lot of that is obviously under case-by-case situation, under medical observation and authority, and typically it's very low microdosing of stuff. We're not giving people 6 grams of shrooms and telling them that it's going to cure their anxiety or something. But it's definitely in a very kind of medical setting of sorts of how do we titrate this out and use it and monitor and observe it. So I think there's a lot of big potential for doing that. So I definitely agree with you there.
It's exciting.
Anything else that you just want to say in close? Anything that you any other final thoughts about mental illness or mental health in general?
I guess that I hope that we're moving in a positive direction. I gave a talk about my book the other day, and someone said, don't you think it's too late? Don't you think the cat's kind of already out of the bag? Like, we're talking about this in the wrong way and we can't correct it now. And I thought, I really just didn't agree with that. Like, I hope we're on a trajectory that we might need to slightly correct, but I think we are moving in the right direction. I think there's lots of exciting stuff about people's openness and willing to talk about how normal this is to be distressed and to have difficulty sometimes. In terms of every year we're building our evidence base in terms of understanding what to do about it. We're not going to eliminate it. It's part of the human condition. But I do feel hopeful that you have to feel hopeful that we're moving in the right direction and that things are improving.
Yeah, well, I completely disagree with that comment in terms of what the person said. I think it's not too late. I think it's super helpful, super essential. Your book is super well written. It's tangible for anybody to kind of understand it. And again, I read a lot of stuff about mental health and I'm just like, oh, goodness, not that, or, oh, this is an old thing, we're not getting past this, or that's not quite accurate, or, this is a shortcut. And I didn't feel that way at all in reading your book. I was like, yep, there, that's really good. Okay. And it's all in really one nice place. And so I can't recommend it highly enough. Your book again is Losing Our Minds, What Mental Illness Really Is and What It Isn't. Tell people where they can find you, where they can find the book, all that good stuff.
Amazon, but if you don't want to contribute to that, it's available in all good bookstores.
In the UK?
In the UK, yes. And Europe and Australia and New Zealand. I recorded the audio version on Audible.
Oh, cool. Very cool.
I think at the moment you can only get it on the UK site. So I think they launched the US one separately in January. And that's it. I think there's a Kindle version.
Okay. And the US version, it comes out January? Do you have a date?
Yeah, I think 21st of January.
Okay. Very, very
somewhat
cool.
younger.
Very, very
It's got
cool.
a different cover.
Oh, cool. I like that. I have to say, it really, buying physical books still, I enjoy the different covers that come out. And some it's like, oh yeah, this one I prefer more than the other or whatever. So it's interesting how the UK and the US do
It's
different
interesting
things.
to see the US one. It's totally different. And yeah,
Yeah.
same book inside. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it's received in the States, for sure.
Yeah. Well, look, Lucy, this was so much fun. You're such a delight, and you're really, really great. And I love your work, and I'm a big supporter. And so keep doing what you're doing, and I hope listeners will really take to heart everything that you said.
Thanks so much. Oh yeah, thank you for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.